Let's start somewhere very specific. A gas station in the American Midwest. Not New York, not California. A place where economic policy usually exists only as a campaign slogan. Gas prices are nearly $1 higher than they were just months ago. Grocery bills climb week after week. Transportation costs rise day by day. And here is the most important part. None of this is random. What is happening is not natural inflation. It is not a market cycle. It is not an external shock beyond control. It is the direct result of a trade war that was misunderstood at its foundation. That war was designed to project strength. Instead, it exposed dependence. The core mistake: misunderstanding leverage. For decades, Washington operated under a very simple assumption. Canada needs the United States more than the United States needs Canada. On paper, the logic looks solid. Canada sends more than 75 to 80% of its exports to the U.S. market, an open border, integrated supply chains, an economy more tightly linked to the United States than any other G7 nation. But what policymakers failed to account for was the nature of mutual dependence. The United States does not merely buy from Canada. The United States is built around those flows. Energy, industry, transportation, food, especially heavy crude oil. Roughly 60% of U.S. crude oil imports come from Canada. And not all oil is the same. Refineries across the Midwest and the Rocky Mountain region were designed specifically to process Canadian heavy crude. They cannot quickly switch to lighter oil from Texas or North Dakota. This is not a political argument. It is chemistry and infrastructure. Tariffs did not hit Canada, they hit America. When tariffs were imposed on Canadian energy, there was an unspoken expectation. Canada would absorb the cost, Canadian companies would suffer, Ottawa would concede. That did not happen. Instead, gas prices across much of the Midwest rose by 30 to 70 cents per gallon. Every commute, every truck route, every logistics chain. And that was only the first layer. When fuel prices rise, everything else follows. Food, construction materials, consumer goods. This is not a side effect. This is how the real economy functions. Canada did not stand still. It shifted the axis. There was a moment Washington did not recognize until it was already too late. Canada did not respond emotionally. There was no rhetorical escalation, no media spectacle, no symbolic retaliation. Instead, Canada redirected the flow of power. In 2024, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion was completed. For the first time in modern history, Canadian oil gained direct access to the Pacific. That single development changed the equation entirely. Canadian oil was no longer trapped in the US market, it became a global commodity. And Asia, especially China, was ready to buy. The overlooked factor: technical compatibility with China. Chinese refineries, like those in the United States, are designed to process heavy crude. When the US imposed tariffs, Canada did not lose a market, it replaced one. Meanwhile, American consumers had no immediate alternatives. Pipelines flow in one direction. Refineries cannot be retooled in months. Conversion requires years and tens of billions of dollars. This was not a tactical misstep, it was a structural error. Not a traditional politician. The defining difference in this period was not just policy, it was leadership. Mark Carney did not emerge from party politics. He came from central banking and global crisis management. He understands capital flows, financial stability, and most importantly, invisible leverage. While Washington spoke in terms of tariffs, Carney spoke in terms of risk diversification. And that is where the story moved far beyond energy. Supply chains, where real leverage lives. Look at the North American auto industry. A single component can cross the US-Canada border 7 times before becoming part of a finished vehicle. This system evolved over decades to maximize efficiency, not withstand confrontation. When tariffs enter the system, costs compound, not once, but at every crossing. The results were immediate. Factories paused operations, production slowed, vehicle prices rose by thousands of dollars. Not because of technological failure, but because policy choked a system never designed for conflict. The most important consequence: trust collapses. Trade is not just the movement of goods. It is trust in predictability. When a partner becomes unpredictable, businesses seek exits. Canada has begun doing exactly that. Not by abandoning the United States overnight, but by preparing for a world where dependence is no longer absolute. And once a country begins to diversify its strategic options, old leverage stops working. There is a moment when this story moves beyond economics and enters far more dangerous territory. Not at the gas pump, not inside an auto plant, but in the redefinition of strategic partners. The Beijing trip, a signal that cannot be reversed. In January 2026, Mark Carney became the first Canadian Prime Minister in nearly a decade to visit Beijing. He did not go to placate. He did not go to complain. He did not go to lecture about values. He went to sign deals. That message mattered more than any public statement. Canada and China announced a package of agreements that many in Washington never believed would happen. A quota allowing Chinese electric vehicles into Canada at tariffs just over 6%. China sharply reducing tariffs on Canadian canola seed. A formal target to increase Canadian exports to China by 50% by 2030. But the most explosive statement was not written into any agreement. Carney declared that China had become a more predictable trading partner than the United States. This was not praise for Beijing. It was an indictment of Washington. This is not ideology. It is survival. One of the most common mistakes in political analysis is assuming nations act based on values. In reality, nations act based on risk. Canada exports nearly 80% of its goods to the United States. That dependence once provided stability, until it was weaponized. When tariffs became a tool of pressure, Ottawa reached a simple conclusion. Single-axis dependence is dangerous. From that moment forward, the question was no longer, should we diversify? It became, can we move fast enough? Electric vehicles, a new strategic gateway. Canada's decision to open its market to Chinese electric vehicles was not merely a trade choice. It was a strategic detour. While the United States imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, Canada kept its barriers at a symbolic level. That meant batteries, components, technology would concentrate north of the US border. Canada did not violate global trade rules. It exploited policy asymmetry. And once new supply chains take root, the United States no longer controls the center. Strategic minerals, the real leverage. There is one domain Washington rarely discusses, but Beijing understands perfectly. Strategic minerals. Canada holds major reserves of lithium, nickel, cobalt, uranium, rare earth elements. These materials are not just for electric vehicles. They are the backbone of defense systems, semiconductors, and future energy infrastructure. For decades, Canada-US mineral supply chains were assumed. Now, they are optional. When Canada opens its mining sector to Chinese investment, the United States loses its quiet monopoly of access. Not because Canada betrayed America, but because America pushed Canada away. American agriculture, the unmentioned casualty. Tariffs did not stop with steel or automobiles. They spread into food. Canada, China, and Mexico are the three largest export markets for U.S. agriculture. As tensions escalated, all three retaliated. Canada imposed targeted counter tariffs. Beef, dairy, fruit, pork. Not randomly, but deliberately aimed at states that supported these policies. The outcome was predictable. U.S. agricultural exports to Canada dropped sharply. Domestic oversupply increased, commodity prices fell, input costs rose due to steel and machinery tariffs. An industry promised protection found itself crushed from both sides. The silent border, a warning signal. One of the least discussed, yet most alarming indicators was cross-border traffic between the United States and Canada. In 2025, crossings fell by 20 to 27%, depending on the state. Not because of a pandemic, not because of security threats, but because of rising costs and consumer backlash. Canadian tourism to the U.S. collapsed. Hotels emptied, restaurants closed, border retailers lost customers. The communities hit hardest were not coastal elites. They were small towns in conservative border states. July 2026, the fracture point. All of these forces converge on a single date. July 2026. A mandatory review of the North American Trade Agreement. There are three possible outcomes. Extension, the system survives. Renegotiation, prolonged instability. No extension, the termination process begins. Washington wants to rewrite the rules. Ottawa and Mexico are preparing paths that do not rely on the United States. If the agreement collapses, supply chains unravel, Canadian minerals flow to Asia, Canadian energy sells at global prices, North America loses its integrated advantage. And most importantly, trust does not return quickly. America's fortress was not breached from outside. No country attacked the United States in this story. There was no conspiracy, no hostile alliance, only a chain of rational responses to a strategy that misunderstood power. Canada did not leave the United States because it wanted to. It stepped away because it needed alternatives. And once those alternatives function smoothly, old leverage no longer works. Conclusion: leverage is not pressure. Tariffs do not create power. They reveal who depends on whom. Higher gas prices, more expensive vehicles, struggling farmers, empty border towns. These are not necessary sacrifices. They are the symptoms of a failed strategy. The question is no longer, how far can the United States push Canada? It is, can the United States correct course before this structure becomes permanent? There is a dangerous misunderstanding in how many people view the July 2026 timeline. They see it as a negotiation, a routine review, a moment where a last-minute compromise is still possible. But in reality, July 2026 is not a beginning. It is a confirmation. The most important decisions were made years earlier in how nations prepared their alternatives. When the agreement is no longer the foundation. If the North American Trade Agreement is not extended, the system does not collapse overnight. It erodes. Businesses delay investment, supply chains stop expanding, new factories are not built, capital flows toward more stable regions. There is no chaos, only money quietly leaving. And once capital leaves, it rarely returns. Canada, after 2026, no longer default. For most of modern history, Canada was treated as a safe extension of the American system. Energy for the United States, minerals for the United States, supply chains for the United States, security tied to the United States. After 2026, none of that is automatic. Canada begins operating as a middle power broker, selling energy to global markets, allocating minerals according to strategic interest, choosing partners based on stability, not emotion. This is not a dramatic rupture. It is a cold rebalancing. Energy from continental resource to global commodity. Once Trans Mountain reaches full operation, Canadian oil is no longer locked into the U.S. market. After 2026, prices align with global benchmarks, long-term contracts shift toward Asia, the United States becomes a customer, not the center. This fundamentally alters Washington's position. Tariffs lose their power as an immediate pressure tool. The assumption that Canada has no alternatives disappears. Minerals, what money cannot quickly buy. The United States can subsidize. The United States can tariff. The United States can inject capital. But one thing cannot be created quickly: secure mineral supply chains. After 2026, if Canada diversifies partners, signs long-term contracts with Europe and Asia, ties mineral exports to industrial agreements, the United States loses structural advantage, not price advantage. This directly affects Defense systems, semiconductors, batteries, advanced technology. Not over 1 year, but over 10 to 20. The United States, a superpower self-isolating its supply chains. There is a central paradox after 2026. The United States wants economic sovereignty, secure supply chains, reduced external dependence. Yet it weakens the closest, most stable system it already has. When North America is no longer integrated, the U.S. must rebuild infrastructure at higher cost. Companies consider relocating to Asia or Europe. Consumers absorb permanently higher prices. This is not reindustrialization. It is self-inflicted structural inflation. Europe and Asia, the quiet beneficiaries. Every trade conflict produces third-party winners. After 2026, the European Union gains access to Canadian industry and defense markets. Japan and South Korea expand technological cooperation. China secures stable energy and mineral supply. No one needs to defeat the United States. They only need to be more predictable than the United States. The uncomfortable truth: leverage does not exist without trust. One element repeats throughout this entire story. Trust. Not emotion, not military alliances, but predictability. When a country becomes unpredictable, businesses withdraw, partners seek alternatives, leverage dissolves. Canada did not choose China or Europe. Canada chose stability. After everything, this is not a story about Canada. This is a story about how economic power functions in the 21st century. Tariffs do not create centers. Pressure does not create loyalty. Threats do not create stability. The strongest systems are not those that coerce. They are the ones others do not want to leave. Final conclusion. After July 2026, the world does not collapse. North America does not disappear. But the role of the United States changes. From center to one option. From default to something that must be persuaded. From leverage to rebuilding trust. And that is the hardest task. Not because the United States lacks power, but because power no longer automatically converts into influence. This trade war did not make America stronger. It forced America to confront itself. And in the modern world, that may be the most expensive lesson of all.